Hello, everyone. I want to do a video reviewing the study questions for the first half of Plato's Phaedo. It's difficult work. I mean, everything you've read in this course is difficult. I, it is. The readings are hard, but they're incredibly rewarding, I think. And I think that this week we begin reading something that's very substantial. It's going to take us 2 weeks to read it. The next reading after this, Paul Landsberg's The Experience of Death. It's also quite substantial and will take 2 weeks. It's the hardest part of the course. It's a hard course, and this is the hardest part. These questions I've asked you are not easy questions. And, you know, it's rough, but it's doable. And the Plato's Phaedo is a great work. It's one of the very few great things written about death. I mean, Epicurus, Landsberg's The Experience of Death, and Plato's Phaedo, I think, are the top three without question. It's very rewarding. But let me just go through what I had in mind for answers to each question. Number one, why does Socrates believe the philosopher should welcome death? That's pretty straightforward, because it's only upon death that the philosopher can get what they really want, which is knowledge. For various reasons, as we've seen, Socrates believes that true knowledge is of the absolute. It's something that can be grasped with the mind alone, that we do not get real knowledge through the senses, and that the senses act as a kind of distraction from the soul, or of the soul from truth, and that upon death, when the soul or mind or intellect is liberated from the body, then the philosopher can get what the philosopher really wants, which is knowledge. So the quick answer to that question is because the philosopher can only get truth after death. And that really depends upon the second question: how does Socrates conceive of death? Socrates conceives of death fundamentally as the separation of soul and body. That is the answer to that question. And it's such an important departure from the Epicurean way of thinking about things, because the Epicurean way of thinking about it is death isn't a separation of anything. Death is the end of everything. Whereas Socrates sets up this whole philosophy of the immortality of the soul by first conceiving fundamentally, first principle, fundamental assumption, that death is the separation of soul and body. And then, of course, based upon that fundamental conception, he's got to prove that the soul can exist without the body. That is, that the soul can continue to have an existence independent of body, which is the real hard part, right? But the fundamental conception of death is, in Plato, in this dialogue at least, is that death is the separation of soul and body. Number three, why does Socrates say, and I'm sorry, the pagination is probably different here, so I'm sorry if that was a difficult question, that the philosopher dishonors the body? Well, because the body is a distraction from what the philosopher wants, which is truth, which is knowledge. The body, with its desires and with the senses, it waylays the mind or the soul. It drags it down. And the philosopher, in this heroic conception of the philosopher that Socrates presents in the first part of the dialogue, that the philosopher is the one who's really preparing for death by separating as much as possible from the body in life. Trying not to pay too much attention to the senses, trying to tamp down their desires. It's quite similar to the spiritual or ascetic practice of many religions, actually. Hinduism, Christianity, just to name two, where the senses, the desires lead you into illusion. So if you're going to be a spiritual person, you've got to overcome the senses and overcome the desires, that sort of thing. Number four, what does the argument from opposites try to establish about the soul? Well, it tries to establish that the soul is immortal, but more particularly that if everything comes from its opposite, And if life and death are opposites, then life, and the soul is alive, comes from death in the same way that death, not in the same way, excuse me, not in the same way, but in a similar way that death comes from life. So the argument about the soul is that living souls come from the dead. It is some sort of reincarnation idea. And here, I don't know how much this argument is really worth going into too much because it's only one. But the idea is that clearly the dead come from the living. And he wants to argue that you can go further and say that the living come from the dead. In both cases, things emerging out of their opposites. I don't know how seriously to take that argument. It's quite conceptually interesting, but I don't know. Number 5, why does Socrates believe that knowledge is recollection? And what does this have to do with the immortality of the soul? Well, here it gets kind of intertextual. What they're doing is, in their first, at least, discussion of this issue of knowledge as recollection, they're really referring to other conversations. And there are other dialogues, most notably the Meno, another dialogue by Plato, where it goes into this quite explicitly. The idea that there's no such thing as learning something new, that all we do is remember what we have already learned. And the idea here is that they use the example of equality, and by that they mean mathematical equality, like two numbers being equal, or two quantities really being equal, and that we've never actually seen two absolutely identical or completely equal quantities in real life, but we have this idea of absolute equality. Just like we've never seen something that's absolutely beautiful in the fullest respect, although we have this idea of beauty in itself. And the idea is that when we see some of the things that are roughly equal, or if we see something that's imperfectly beautiful, it reminds us, it stimulates us to recollect the perfect form of equality or the perfect form of beauty. And the idea is that if knowledge is recollection, that the soul must have existed before we were born, basically, before it was incarnated into a body. And therefore, if true, it would be an important thing for Socrates, because it would at least establish that at some time in the past, the soul existed independent of the body. Of course, it doesn't quite prove that the soul will exist independent of the body after death, after that so-called separation, but it's an important step. Number 6, if the soul is like the forms, how does this argue for its immortality? Well, the forms are Plato's idea of these eternal ideas. I like to give the example of mathematical concepts rather than the forms, because the forms are more controversial. But forms like the absolute idea of justice, the absolute idea of beauty, the absolute idea of equality, that these are eternal and changeless. The notion of death does not apply to something that's a pure concept, that its being is beyond death. And the idea is that if the soul or mind is enough like the forms, then it too must be eternal and deathless. So it's part of what is sometimes called the argument from affinity. If the soul is enough like the forms, then it must also be eternal and therefore immortal. Number 7, describe Simmias's argument that soul as harmony does not outlast the body. This is a very complex argument, I think, but basically the idea is that the soul's relationship to the body is like the harmony's relation to the physical musical instrument. He gives the example of the lyre. And although the harmony is immaterial, it doesn't have any physical aspect to it. It's produced by the physical instrument and is dependent upon the physical instrument. So if the physical instrument is destroyed, so is the harmony. The harmony cannot exist without it. If the soul's relationship to the body is like that, then the prospects for immortality are dashed. It's impossible, because if the soul is like a harmony, then the soul, although it's immaterial and unphysical, is produced by the body. and dependent upon the body for its existence, so that when the body dies, as it surely does at death, so goes the soul as well. It's the profound, most important, I think, challenge to Socrates' belief in the immortality of the soul that that we get in the Phaedo.